Good evening, everyone. If you could please join me in silent meditation. So if you could sit up straight in your chair, your feet flat on the floor, and your shoulders relaxed. Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namadats, namadats, namadats. So as Michael said earlier, we're going to be chanting the Juni Rai together, which is on page 55 of the Hawaii Service Book or in the PDF. I have allergies, so my voice might not hold out so well. So please excuse my chanting voice today. 가건 조세간 이시무조도 시간 불만족 세부조쇼각 가어무려고 Vui đại se shu, vu sai sho bing se pu jo sho gak, ga shi jo butsu do, myo sho cho ji po, ku kyo mi sho mon. Seifu Joshogak Diok Jin Shonen Joe Shubongyo Shigum Jodo Isho Teninchi Jinniki Endai Ko 不所無祭道、少女三苦名、五歳主役難、回避知恵言、滅しこも安、閉塞小悪道、四大自然修門、高僧上満足、いよろじぽ、日月修十期、天候恩不減、一種解放像、公正功徳法、上大集中、説法四式、供養一切仏、具足修徳本、元年出上満、得意三害用、如仏無下知、通達未不詳、願学ウェディック、 年最小尊、志願役か、大仙お感動、国書天人、東内妙見。ナマダダナマダナマダブナマダブナマダブ願にしく読、平等性祭、道本菩提心、往生安那コ。Namadots, namadots, 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 namadots. So if you excuse me, I'm going to get a throat lozenge. My voice is pretty darn raw. Just a second, please. Hmm. Excuse my the lozenge. What's one of the advantage things about living in New York, I didn't know how my allergies would be. And today I really haven't spoken to anybody. When I started chanting, I'm like, oh my gosh. So I guess I get the Flonase or some other kind of medication out. So excuse me a second. Okay, great. Well, thank you for joining us this evening. Things have been going very busily here in New York. I had my first introduction to Buddhism class here in New York this last weekend. And as I mentioned before, the temple, or actually we call it the church, is up on the Upper West Side, actually near Columbia, which has been unfortunately in the news quite a bit. The amount of helicopters that have been flying around and the disruption's been pretty intense. And so, but that is our neighborhood. So we have a very diverse neighborhood. We have a lot of families in the neighborhood. People don't think of that with Manhattan per se, but we have a lot of the professors from Columbia. I'm sorry, folks, my throat is really killing me. Um, and uh, so I started this class, and I think I mentioned a couple of weeks ago we had Hanamatsuri here in New York, and Hanamatsuri, we had 20 new people come for the service, which is quite an excitement for any of our churches or temples in the BCA. And people are simply coming from the neighborhood because we had a banner outside. And so in conjunction with that, we started the class on Intro to Buddhism. And a lot of people do have the general ideas or the general concepts of what the Buddhist teachings are. But it's always fascinating to me to do the introduction and have people go around the room, introduce themselves and why they're interested in Buddhism. And people really appreciate sharing. I'm sorry, guys, I'm gonna have to take a pause here. So, uh, again, so we do have a diversity in our neighborhood. This is traditionally a Jewish neighborhood. So we do have people that come in and identify as Jewish, but they want to hear what the Buddhist teachings are. And one of the words that comes up a lot, which is something that is in our everyday English in the United States and around the world, is the word karma. And so in this diverse group, we know we had a high school student that was a student that was taking a class. We had older people, and everybody's like, well, because they wanted to know certain words. What does karma mean? And I thought that today I would focus on that because in Shin Buddhism, we have a different understanding of what karma is. Now, karma, as we know that in the general vernacular in the United States, it's talked about kind of a fatalistic concept. It's the idea that, a lot of the common expressions is that if something good happens to somebody, they have good karma, or if something bad happens to somebody, that they have bad karma. And this is, I'm afraid I'm going to lose my voice, guys. I'm really worried about that. So I will make the talk shorter today because I think I am going to lose my voice. So again, the idea of what karma means is that what I tried to explain in the beginning Buddhist class is that when Buddhism or when Shakyamuni Buddha became the Buddha in what is now between Nepal and India, it was not a vacuum of cultural or spiritual teachings. Hinduism was thriving for 1,000 years, at least 1,000 years before Shakyamuni Buddha discovered what we call enlightenment. And so the idea is that when the Buddha talks about words, a lot of the words that they use are interconnected with both Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism. And the construct or the meaning context can be quite different amongst them. So when we hear about this idea of, the fatalistic type of karma is more of like what I think is like a general view of maybe perhaps what the Hindu system works. Now, in Buddhism, and one of the questions that a lot of people are asking, because a lot of times people hear, do Buddhists have a soul? Which is a very difficult question for someone to wrap their mind around, because most spiritual traditions talk about your internal soul, and your internal soul will go on in the next life. And so people, when they hear about, do you have a soul in Buddhism, it's a very perplexing question to them. And the technical answer to that is that we do have a soul or a presence, a consistency of the body. So here I am, Kurt, I've been on this earth for 62 years, and I am definitely a real situation. I'm a real person or a soul. But in Buddhism, we say that it's not a permanent soul. That means that once we leave this physical realm, that there's not going to be a Kurt that goes on into nirvana or onto the Pure Land. The idea is that a lot of times when we talk about the term nirvana, they talk about the extinguishing of a flame. And one of the more common metaphors is they talk about that, for example, with karma or with lives, it's like having the candle that's lit, and then you light another candle, and that candle takes the flame, but it's not the original candle. And so that's the idea about having a permanent soul, is that there is something that connects us. So when we talk about karma, in Hinduism, they say specifically, it's talking about the soul carrying the burden of karma. So that's quite a different construct. So here we're just mentioning that in Buddhism, we don't talk about a permanent soul. And in the class, of course, there's always good questions, and they're asking, well, what is the point of karma if it's not carried on from one lifetime to another? And we agree that that would be a great question to ask perhaps a Theravadan monk or someone from a different tradition. What is their belief? Because they do believe in reincarnation. As we well know that in the Tibetan school of Buddhism, that when the Dalai Lama passes away, there's a ritual where they will pick someone, a young boy, that they believe that the Dalai Lama's soul or essence has been transported into, and they have these vigorous tests that they do to see if this is the actual transmission. So in Shin Buddhism, getting to this idea of karma and reincarnation, it's always assumed that this is part of the Buddhist teachings, and indeed it is. When you look at the writings of Shinran Shonin, he talks about our past lives. He says, the causes and conditions that have brought us here to hear the teachings, to be honored, to be born into the human form so that we can hear the teaching of the Buddha. Because the tradition is that you need to be born as a human being to be able to comprehend the teachings of the Dharma. A cat or a monkey theoretically wouldn't be able to do that. And I've had people debate that with me. But I mean, the traditional form is that you do have to have the ability, the cognizant ability to be able to process that. And so the idea is that in Shinran, he says specifically, we've quoted it before, it says, how can I be angry with this person or have violence towards this person when they've been my sister, my mother, my brother, my husband, my wife in past lives? And indeed, when I was at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, there's interesting because when you look at the letters that Ishini wrote, or you look at the letters that Renyo wrote, or Shinran wrote, a lot of times it's this typical "I will see you in the Pure Land." And so some of the scholars said, did he mean that literally, or is it a figurative of speech? And at that time, the article that we read, there's people on both sides, whether he meant it literally or not, because as we remember, Shinran was a Tendai monk, and his original understanding of Pure Land Buddhism is different than what he formulated that we are following now. And so the idea is that when he says, "I will see you in the Pure Land," how how did he mean that? So getting back to this idea of karma. So in Hinduism, like I said, it's the soul carrying it on. And then that soul is bringing it back into birth, into rebirth. And Jainism, which is another form of spirituality that's actually still practiced in India. The iconography is very similar to Buddhism. If you see a statue of the deity, it looks very much like a Buddha. They have a lot of similar techniques and practices. Ironically, they survived in India where Buddhism was wiped out as an institution. The Jains that are in India now, a lot of them are professionally work in the banking industry. So that's an interesting, I don't know why, it'd probably be a really interesting article to read about how that was preserved, that cultural component and that spiritual component went through the centuries where the Buddha Dharma eventually faded from India until the Tibetans brought it back as a living tradition. And so then again, in Buddhism, there is the concept of karma. And so what about the idea of that, that is something that we inherit, it's something that we can utilize. In Shin Buddhism, we talk about, we put things into motion. It's our causes and conditions, that what we do is what we step forward with. And I'll be honest, I had Professor Corliss, Reverend Kenji Akahoshi, before he became a minister. We were students at IBS, and we would go to Professor Corliss's home, and he was a brilliant British professor. And he said, "Well, what's your understanding of karma?" And Kenji and I, both Shin Buddhists, said, "Well, it's causes and conditions." He goes, "Oh no, that's all wrong," because his view is from a different perspective of the Buddhist teachings. And so this idea of that, how we talk about karma is important, especially for us in Shin Buddhism. And I'll get back to the causes and conditions here in a moment. But I would like to share a quick story before I lose my voice about experiencing people taking karma in a very literal form. So, excuse me here. Okay. When I was living at the IBS dormitory, there were people from different traditions. We had a gentleman that was a Theravada monk, and we had Dong Ho, who was a Korean Zen nun. And so she lived the traditional monast lifestyle. She had her head shaved, she wore robes. In her room, the bed was disassembled and put in the corner because, monks and nuns are not supposed to sleep above the floor, they're supposed to sleep on the floor. So she was very traditional, and it was kind of a difficult living situation, to be honest, because we all had our individual little rooms, but we had all these community areas, right? And so, and I was the dorm manager at that time. And so I would interact with the people that were living in the dorm on a different capacity than just being another fellow student. And Dong Ho got really, really upset with me. And I didn't know what I had done wrong. And so I'm in my room, and she comes walking into the middle of my room, walking right up to me like this, which, first of all, for us as Americans and, opposite gender, you don't go into someone else's room and walk up to them and start talking and she was really animated and really upset. And her English is pretty good. And so then it was really frustrating to me. So I talked to Professor Grumbach, who talked to her. And what she said, I found absolutely fascinating. She said that, "I feel sorry because I like Kurt. I think he's a nice person, but he and I have a really bad karmic connection. He was mean to me and abused me in a previous life." And so I was like, this was the first time I'd ever experienced someone taking karma at that level of intensity and that literally. And so it was very strange because I asked her if we could do a loving kindness meditation together, if that would be helpful for her. And she agreed to do it. But in her mind, that karmic event happened in the past, and there was nothing that I could do to change it or she could do to change it. I remember after I moved out of the dormitory, I saw her in Berkeley, And she was walking on the street, and she walked across the street so she wouldn't have to see me. That was how intense that connection was. And again, I think that gave me the insight to, like, sometimes when we talk about the fatalistic type form of karma, where that things are done by predispositions. Even in Pure Land Buddhism, there are teachings that will say that if someone is born into this world with a physical deformity, whether that's if they're deaf or if they can't see, that they've done something wrong in the past life, and that's why they're born that way. And I got into a doctrinal debate with one of my fellow Shin ministers about that, because he says, don't you judge the ranks? And I said, well, Sensei, that doesn't make sense to me, because we're all equal. And, and again, I pointed out, and Joe knows this, and Seattle is very famous for having a very large, diverse deaf community. And you'll see them everywhere on Capitol Hill, and they don't consider it a disability at all. And so that we're coming in saying that you've got a disability, you did something wrong in your past life. Is this idea of that karma being fatalistic is something that I don't follow, and especially in Shin Buddhism, we don't follow either. So in this beginning Buddhist class, I tried to emphasize that, we don't follow this idea of that, that there's something that's fatalistic, that's not, that it's our causes and conditions. And with the Dharma school kids, a lot of times I'll talk about karma being like, if you're interacting with somebody that you don't get along with, how you interact with them is what you're creating the karma. It's not something that comes from the past. So let's say Eric Ishii and I get into a debate, and I get mad at him and I yell at him. That's the karma that no offense, Eric, I'm not mad at you, don't worry. But that's the cause and effect. That is the karma that you're setting into motion, the actions. And again, the idea of karma, it is an action. It's just not a psychological thing. It is something that is set into motion. And like I said, with Hinduism, they say the soul carries that karma. For us in Shin Buddhism, we're not as worried about past karma as what the karma that we're creating now. I am losing my voice here, so what I'm going to do is I just wanted to bring up a couple interesting aspects about karma that's very specifically relates to Shin Buddhism. The first one is called karmic evil, akuo in Japanese, which, of course, when we hear the word evil, we tend to go into a Geo-Christian thinking that, oh, it's evil, like good versus evil. But evil in this case is the very Buddhistic form of saying impurity, that it's not pure, that it's defiled. Okay, so I think I prefer the word defiled to evil, but I know evil is a technical definition of the Japanese word. And what it's saying is that in this karmic evil is that it's something that all human beings have, that's universal, that all of the impurities that we have is something that happens in our daily life. And this is something that we must reflect upon. But the Shin teaching about this is that they talk about the working power of amida. So this is not a self-power practice, is that when we talk about all of the karma, all the defiled karma that we have in the world that we deal with on a daily basis, it's not for us to worry about eradicating it, is that this is the time when we try to focus on the concept of other power, that the working of amida is the cause of this suffering, this karma to be softened. And so again, when we talk about self-power and other power, we're not trying to focus the teachings on karma back upon ourselves. Is that I don't like the word salvation, but that's what they use in the dictionary. It says here, yet it is a major concern of Amida's salvific power contained in the primal vow, which will not rest, and this is interesting, will not rest until evil karma is transformed into the contents of enlightenment. That's fascinating to me, because I know, I like the word transform, and I've used it a lot. But here what it's talking about is not to get rid of this karmic evil, it is to transform it into the contents of enlightenment. For those that are wondering what I'm reading out of the collected works of Shinran, the glossary, the second part of the book. This is the definition of karmic evil. And also, they also talk about the karmic power of the great vow. And again, this is talking about that the primal vow or Amida salvation is through the name, and that karmic are both, it says that the name karmic and both characteristic of powers of the vow. So again, the idea is that we're not working on this ourselves, that is part of the workings of Amida, the teachings set forward, and that they get transformed into the elements of enlightenment. So thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry I'm losing my voice. So what I'd like us to do is, actually, Michael, can you do the group reading for me? I'd really appreciate that if you could lead that.
I'll be glad to. Just give me a second to pull it up on my screen.
Okay, thank you.
Unless, Joe, you might have it there because I'm going to have to dig through my files. Would you be so good, sir? Rather than, because when you know how when you're looking for something on your computer, you don't find it. Well, that's going to be me. So
I do, and I hope this is the same one that you've been using. If you'll read along with me, our pledge. Breaking out of my shell, I will share a warm smile and speak gentle words, just like the kind Buddha. Not becoming lost in my greed, anger, and ignorance, I shall think and act with an open mind, just like the calm and peaceful Buddha. Not putting myself first, I will share in the joy and sadness of others, just like the compassionate Buddha. Realizing the gift of life I have received, I shall strive to live each day to its fullest, like the Buddha who tirelessly works to liberate all. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namanda.
Thank you very much, Joe. I appreciate that. So I'd like us to go into another short quiet meditation. So if you could sit straight in your chair, feet flat on the floor with your shoulders relaxed, please. Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Butsu.